Hello, and welcome to Food for You and the Planet, a fresh new podcast that explores healthy and environmentally sustainable food solutions. I'm Dr. Rosemary Ostfeld, and I'm your host. This podcast is brought to you by Healthy Plan Eat online farmers market. Be sure to hit the subscribe button to hear all the latest in healthy and sustainable food. Today's episode features Arthur Haines, Senior Research Botanist at the Native Plant Trust. Arthur is a plant biologist specializing in the taxonomy and identification of New England tracheotypes. He is the Senior Research Botanist for Native Plant Trust and author of Flora, Novae, Angliae, published by New England Wildflower Society and Yale University Press, and several other books, including Flora of Maine, A New Path, and Ancestral Plants, a 2-volume set on edible, medicinal, and useful plants. In addition to his work studying advancement in plant systematics, Arthur is an administrator for the Go Botany and Plant Share websites and a Flora of North America regional reviewer. Thank you so much for being here today, Arthur.
Hi there, Rosemary. Thanks for inviting me on your podcast.
Great. So let's start off. What is the Native Plant Trust and what type of work does it do?
Well, I think the answer that you would get might depend on who you ask. I've worked for them for over 20 years now, and I'm part of the conservation department. And as you might guess, with a title like the Conservation Department, the work that I do centers on conserving New England's rarest plants, whether these are globally or regionally rare species. Obviously, Native Plant Trust has an education department and a horticultural department that do very different things from me. But I'm part of a lineage of people who have worked for New England's oldest plant conservation organization.
How did you become interested in native plants, foraging, and become a senior research botanist at the Native Plant Trust?
Boy, that's a story. Essentially, many years ago, I happened to meet a gentleman that some people may know the name. His name was Les Eastman. And while he was a junior high social studies teacher, one of his passions was plants. And this was kind of a bigger, heavier set guy with thick glasses. And he didn't look the part, right? He wasn't, say, nimble as he moved through the forest, but yet he had a real ability to understand what rare plants needed in terms of the associated species that were with them, the microsite conditions. And we would just go around. I accompanied him on lots of trips when I was just getting into college. And we would relocate all of these species that in some cases had not been seen for decades or even longer than that. Just I'll quickly give you this story about Les Eastman to help you understand why I became so fascinated with what he did. He came to me to ask for help in this rural town where he didn't understand all the local dirt roads and everything, but it's near where I grew up. So we spent several hours driving around on these roads looking for a rare fern called Diopterus goldiana. So this is the common name is Goldie's fern. And it hadn't been seen since 1940. And we went around and we never got out of the car. And I was like, why don't we look over here? Why don't we look over here? And he's like, no, it's not. And so after hours of driving around in this vehicle, he stops the car and he goes, I smell Goldie's fern. And I'm like, this is ridiculous, right? We haven't even gotten out of the car yet. So we step out of the vehicle and we take maybe 15 steps into the forest. And he taps me on the shoulder. And there it was. He had found it. And it was this near magical ability, it seemed at first, but later I came to understand it was an art where he used many different scientific disciplines to help understand where to find these things. I'm like, I want to do what that guy does. This is the most amazing thing ever. And then I literally began my academic studies in botany doing that. And I came to work for the for Native Plant Trust as a plant taxonomist, working in herbaria, which are plant museums, looking at dried specimens of the regionally rare species through all the 6 states of New England, a 2-year project that ultimately launched into other works.
Amazing. That sounds like quite the amazing skill to be able to find these native plants so easily. So,
Absolutely.
a great mentor. What are some of the native plants that are common in different regions, including in New England?
Well, it's a question that I'm not sure I can boil down for you because we have so many species. New England has, you know, well over 3,500 species of of plants that occur in the region. And if we add all the hybrids between those species, that number jumps up even more. But maybe a way to answer this is a lot of species that people know of and see on a fairly regular basis, they may not realize that these are some of the most wonderful edible species out there. And we could go around talking about many things, like here in Maine, the state tree is the eastern white pine. And I know very few people who gather the pollen of this tree, which is actually this wonderful food that is even sold in health circles as a superfood because of its density of nutrition, its antioxidants, and it also its phytoandrogens that essentially give people who are dealing with a very how about we say plasticized world that puts all of these xenoestrogens into our bodies as a way to combat those kinds of things. Or we could look at a plant like common milkweed. I mean, everyone knows about the milkweed and the monarch butterflies, and few realize that this is a plant food that is available to us as a native edible plant starting in my part of the world in the early to mid part of May and going through for a lot of the summer. It just keeps offering new and different parts for food. Um, Hopefully, you can see where I'm going with this. There's a lot of plants that grow right in our backyards that offer all of these wonderful foods. And many people, I'm not sure they're aware that a lot of the wild species, oh, that's an exaggeration maybe a bit, but many of them have been tested for their nutrient density. And come to find out, in many cases, they are much more endowed with a density of nutrition than the cultivated foods that we routinely eat. And I can go into more details on that if you happen to have interest or maybe later on. But yeah, we have a lot of common species. And man, the diversity that we have of native wild plants that can be served in our table or on our table is way beyond the diversity that we can find in the supermarket. So it really adds a lot of flavor to our diet.
One of the projects that you worked on was the New England Wildflower Society's Flora Novae Angliae. Can you tell me a little bit about that work and how people can use it?
Well, at its core, it is a big compendium. It's a manual to identify all of the tracheophytes in New England. And a tracheophyte are the higher vascular plants, which includes the ferns. It includes the non-flowering seed plants. Those are the pines and cedars and spruces and things like that. And then all of the flowering plants that many of us are familiar with. And there are so many of these that to produce a comprehensive manual that allows the identification of all of those plants, it has to get big. So we're talking about 1,000-page manual to be able to work through all those things. I'm always envious of other taxonomic or people who study other taxonomic groups. People who study birds or mammals have nowhere near this much diversity that they have to contend with. But that's what's required to be able to identify all of New England's tracheophytes or higher vascular plants. And this work, we were nearly 7 years in its writing, and that was based on a couple of decades of work prior to that of compiling a lot of information. So it's a massive work, and now we're working on the second edition that will hopefully come out um, by the end of this year or shortly into the coming year.
So in that, what are some examples of some of your favorite edible native plants? Like if someone were to start foraging, and I'll ask you a little later, a little bit more about what foraging is, but yeah, what are
Mhm.
some of the really good edible native plants that people might be able to find here in New England?
Well, let me share with you, Rosemary, that I love a large variety of wild edible plants, and they grace our table on most days. In fact, we gather enough to be able to consume them throughout the year. But I've really come to enjoy those storable foods, those things that I can enjoy, because many wild plants are available for just a week or two, sometimes maybe for a month, and then they're gone for the year. And some of those are very difficult to store, so you have to enjoy them in season. So I'm going to share a few that we gather in abundance, and some of them are may even surprise, like, oh yeah, I guess that is a wild food. One of those is maple syrup, right? The sap that comes from the sugar maple or other species like red maple and silver maple is a storable wild food. And this accounts for essentially all of the sugar that we gather in a particular year. All of our baking and other times when we're using sugar comes from maple syrup and maple sugar that we gather right on the property where we live. And maple syrup is more than just a sugar. They have identified about 8 antioxidants that are found in this. There are minerals like manganese. It's very rich in manganese, something that our body uses to create endogenous antioxidants that are really important for our health. And even compounds have been found in maple syrup that can slow and reverse dementia and Alzheimer's. So there's a lot of really cool research that's going on with these wild foods. Another one of my favorites is, of course, wild rice. Maine has wild rice beds. It's a storable food. We gather enough so we can eat. We probably eat it once or twice a week for the entire year. It's a real massive staple of ours, if I were to put it kind of bluntly. And again, when it comes to grains, I don't know that there's any grain on the planet that has the nutrition of wild rice. We use it as a hot cereal in the morning. We use it in our dinners, of course, and in a lot of different ways. And acorns. Again, we're talking about another storable food. And the thing that I love about a lot of these things, we can use them in a variety of ways. We bake acorns into various breads after we've obviously ground them into flour and processed them for their tannins. We make pancakes out of them. Maybe you'll be able to have those at some point. Um, we use them when they're hot leached as kind of like a substitute for legumes. They're really good in a variety of ways that we would use legumes in other dishes. But again, they're storable, so we can gather a lot. And all of these foods are also things that are non lethal collection. So it's a great place for people to start, because when we start committing lethal collection on plants, we actually want to understand the traditional ecological knowledge so we know how and when and where to gather these things to actually perform sustainable collection, which is not something that is a strength of our culture. How about I say that? We haven't learned those time honored techniques of how to replant or to collect certain parts at certain times to make sure that we're not harming the populations. So these are three species that have been gathered for a long period of time on this continent, and they're all non-lethal collections. So it's a great place to start, if you will.
Yeah, you named some great ones that I think, maple syrup, especially, people are like, oh, yeah, of course. So
Right.
now what exactly is foraging? People are starting to use this term more,
Mhm.
even though it's like, something our ancestors have been doing for ages. So what exactly is foraging?
I mean, foraging at its simplest is just the gathering of wild plants on the landscape. And, we could expand foraging to be more than just food, because we also forage for our medicinal plants in my home, or for those plants that we use for various projects, more utilitarian uses, whether that's cordage or tinder or bark for making containers. But most people limit foraging to the gathering of edible wild plants. And again, just to stress the point that in our culture, we kind of just go out and we gather them, we go home and cook them. But foraging historically, and maybe I'll say prior to colonization, there was an entire culture around it that included a lot more than just the picking and eating of the plants. There were ceremonies that were involved. There was gratitude, there was a spirituality, and there was a very specific way that foraging was done for this species or that species to make absolutely sure that those populations were there for later generations. So, hopefully, your listeners, we can expand their idea that foraging is not just the gathering, but it's the entire culture around the use of those plants.
So a lot of people have probably never foraged before. So how can people learn how to forage?
There's a lot of books, there's a lot of videos, but it's always, and I'm sure you understand when I say this, it's always best to find a mentor. The reason I say that is there are just things that are very difficult to convey in a written text that when you encounter certain situations, a human mentor, an elder, a teacher can just guide you past these things. But the biggest thing, and one of the most important obstacles that I've encountered when I'm teaching my foraging students, I go around and I've asked many circles this, what's your biggest fear? And it always centers on the identification because they don't want to poison themselves. And while we have a little bit of a phobia around we're going to kill ourselves because we're going to pick something and eat it, certainly it can happen, but it's a much harder thing to do than many people realize because many toxic plants we have very strong reactions to extreme bitter taste, acrid, or even burning sensations because we have a huge, long history of evolution with these plants that we've been using as food and medicine. And our bodies very frequently get rid of how one end or the other expel this material. But of course, there are some very toxic plants that can be harmful in relatively small doses. So it's the mentor that can guide you through that identification process because that's plant taxonomy. And that is a skill that needs to be learned. And having that person who can guide you through that process and say, no, no, for sure, this is stinging nettle and it is edible, and we're going to do a processing like this to make it edible, allows you to really sit back, relax, and enjoy those flavors that are coming in through those plants. So, to me, finding people who are teaching classes, you know, on foraging is really important. But for people to keep in mind that most foragers aren't plant taxonomists, they have learned a lot about plant identification, but that's not necessarily their job. It's not their profession. And so, if you can find a forager who is also somebody who works in plant taxonomy, well, now you've got sort of the best of both worlds.
What are some of your favorite things about foraging?
Man, well, let's face it, humans walking down well-lit aisles inside a store under climate controlled conditions, that is not something that creates a sense of well-being and connection to the world around us. It has been shown over and over again that rushing around to gather these things, heart rate goes up, blood pressure increases. But when we step outside, and when we step outside to enjoy these awe inspiring but low stress environments, we get the reverse effects. Our breathing calms, our heart rate declines in a positive way here, our blood pressure goes down, and we're getting movement, not just robotic movement marching down an aisle, but movement where we're stepping over and through and ducking down, and we may be reaching down and kneeling and digging. And all of that is very good for the lymph that moves through our body. We're hearing noises potentially, the birds, the insects, the wind, the water, whatever it is. It's a very different noise, and it's noise that we need to be experiencing more often than just the chatter of people and machines and electronics. So there's all of this associated benefit that goes around foraging. And then again, we get to enjoy scientifically documented the most nutrient dense, highest antioxidant, highest fiber, and best ratios of essential fatty acids that benefit our immune systems, help decrease inflammation, and protect us from cancer.
Wow, those are a lot of benefits. Yeah, and definitely it sounds more enjoyable than rushing around the grocery store.
Yeah.
What do you think will be the future of foraging? I know that it's, very ingrained in our past, but do you think it's something that people are going to start doing more of? How do you think this will evolve?
It there's a lot of angles that we could go on that question, but I'm going to be honest. I think one of the biggest threats to foraging is the idea that when humans pick wild plants, they're causing impact. Now, if when I go out to gather the fiddleheads of ostrich fern, now this is a common fern that grows along the rivers here in Maine and throughout a lot of the eastern part of North America. When I go out and I see where deer have eaten these, we sort of see that as this really cool thing. Look, there's nature happening. But when we go out and see where humans have picked them, we go, oh, there's impact. And we have a belief that the only way to save the wild is to avoid interacting with it. And we should only be eating cultivated foods, which of course had to be carved out of the wilderness to create those spaces to grow them. And foraging leaves, in my part of the world where it's mainly forested, it leaves the canopy standing. And with just a little bit of information about what truly sustainable harvests are, we can step into those places and forage in a way that builds connection to those lands. Because let's face it, if we're not foraging, we're not out as much and we're developing apathy for the wild spaces. And so there's these two competing models of conservation. There's what scientists would call fortress conservation, which is leave it alone, put a glass dome, figuratively speaking, over it, and don't let humans interact with it, which of course now people don't understand why that space needs to be protected at all. Or what I call reciprocal conservation, where humans and wild plants can both benefit in the long run, particularly if we're learning traditional ecological knowledge. Because the ways of gathering these things have already been worked out by the indigenous peoples that have lived here for centuries and centuries and centuries. So to me, that's one of the biggest threats to foraging. And we're really missing out on something that's really spectacular. My daughters have done this since birth, and I can't imagine a life where we weren't actually out in the field and in the forest gathering part of our food. Remember, every single thing that we get from the wild is a little bit less that we rely on agriculture. And of course, I have to be thankful for agriculture because it too feeds my family. This isn't meant to sound terrible, but there's a lot of styles of agriculture that are really harmful to the world. And those are being eaten in the supermarkets as well. And so, if we can create ways to put less demand on those harmful agricultural methods, one of those is I'm going to be sovereign and gather my own food from the wild landscapes around me. Well, that's a great thing for us.
Now, something that you touched upon a bit is, agriculture and how we can carve out parts of these ecosystems to have industrial agriculture. So, how have populations of native plants changed over time with industrial agriculture,
Mm.
invasive species, and other challenges that we're facing now?
Yeah, I mean you're touching on what's occurring. Let's face it. What agriculture does is it has to. The methods that we use, we're going to carve a little out of this wilderness. Now, the advantage of that, of course, is that we can intensively manage that land to feed lots of people. But of course, when you feed people, they have more people, and then there's more people to feed, and we need to carve more out of it. And so I think we have this romanticism around what agriculture does for people, but we also need to remember that it is taking bits of the wilderness away, and it is also planting non-native species. The species that are planted there aren't native to the region, but more than that, they are also, virtually all of them are genetically modified. Now, not through laboratory methods, but through breeding. We started with a wild progenitor, and they have been changed over time to the species that we consume now. So if people were to look at, say, the corn that we eat, sweet corn on the cob, and compare it to its wild progenitor, teosinte, they'd see, like, wow, they barely look anything alike. And that was genetic modification to get there. So we've got these things going on. But also, one of the issues that you've brought up are the invasive species that come with the transport of foods all over the world, or even all around the continent. Um, when we have these global transport systems, we can't help but accidentally bring things. And some of those species make massive impacts to the land. While certainly, we have things like Japanese knotweed that have been brought here from Asia. And a lot of people who really appreciate medicinal plants rave about Japanese knotweed because it is a really wonderful and verified remedy for Lyme disease. But of course, this also has some secondary effects here with its harm to biodiversity and bioproportionality on our landscapes, the way it grows at densities to exclude other species. But it's not just the invasive plant species that come, it's the invasive insects that also attack our species, like beeches and hemlocks and other things that are being attacked by various pathogens as well. These invertebrates that are harming these things. So the more we transport foods around the world, the more likely we are to bring new pests and invasive species in, which is the whole point of, like, there, it isn't just a silly little mantra. Going local actually protects the world against a new invasion.
One thing that you touched upon a little bit in that last question was medicinal plants. So,
Mhm.
can you tell me a little bit about your book, Ancestral Plants, a primitive skills guide to important wild, edible, medicinal, and useful plants in the Northeast?
Yeah, what I wanted to do was to write a book that gave more of a holistic understanding of how humans can interact with plants. And there's lots of foraging guides, and there's medicinal plants, and then there's primitive skills books that have been written for which species we might use for friction fire to start fires, or for archery and things like this, or fibers for cordage. But I wanted to write a book that put it all in. So in one source, you could have a better understanding of the ethnobotany, how humans interact with these species. So while I focus heavily on edible plants in this book, um, there's also a great deal of information about medicinal plants, including the scientific studies that support their efficacy, and a lot of useful plants that we use in our daily lives for making baskets, cordage, bows, fire, mastics, which are types of adhesives, dyes, and on and on and on. So, yeah, just think of it as these are all of the ways that these plants can be used, not just the food part.
Yeah, so what are some of the benefits of native plants for our ecosystems, for other plants, wildlife, pollinators? What are some of the benefits that exist, and why are these native plants so important?
I think this is something that there's a lot of research that's going on now, and it's something that people are beginning to understand is really important. On this continent, particularly here where we're talking about a glaciated area, we've got 15,000 years of an unglaciated area where things have been living together, uh, developing collectives, different natural communities of pollinators and plants and soils and birds, mammals, you name it, who have all built these really complex interacting ecosystems. And when we avoid the native plants in favor of non-native things that we bring in for horticulture, especially and agriculture, we disrupt those interactions that have been occurring now for a long while. We also are well aware that a lot of the non-native species are not used as much by the invertebrates, particularly a lot of insects that birds rely on to feed their young. And this is research that's sort of getting out there into the mainstream a little bit more. So when we think of it this way, many of the bird species that are nesting here in New England during the summer, even if they are typically fruit eating species, most of them partly or entirely switch their diets over to invertebrates that they feed their young because it helps their young grow faster. They're much more protein rich, these invertebrates that they're eating. And if there aren't host plants, native host plants for those native insects and other invertebrates, then their numbers decline, which means the songbirds can no longer feed their young and their numbers decline. And it's just, it's a complex interaction that just ends up affecting everybody. But, there's another way that I like to look at it, and I won't go too deep into this, Rosemary, but look, we came here with a very different mindset of how we should interact with the land than the native population had, and that started about 400 years ago. And really, the last vestiges of that colonial mindset is still present on the landscape with the native plant that grows here I could put in front of my home, but I really like this one that comes from the Himalaya, or I really like this one that comes from Europe because I like the color of its leaves or its flowers go a little bit longer. I mean, these are all valuable things, but the point is that we're not trying to fit in with the flow and the ecology of this landscape. We're still trying to go head up against it and say, but this is what I want. And to truly decolonize the way this culture operates, at some point we're going to have to be content with what's here and try to modify less. And so that's just another philosophical argument that I like to get out there of why native plants are so important, because they're important to everything else.
So, how can people grow native plants in their gardens or in their communities? How can they make those choices where maybe they're getting a native plant rather than
Mhm.
something that other people might think looks pretty in their yard?
Right. And I mean, this is really daunting. And I understand why some people would want to plant this species or that species that comes from Eurasia because they are remarkable. And it's not that I'm saying that we should be harboring any, ill wishes toward those plants, but it is daunting because most local nurseries, when you think about the places that people go, whether that's the Home Depot or Lowe's, native is not what the focus is. It's making the sale, right? And fortunately, Native Plant Trust has a beautiful program of offering plants and even guidance for homeowners who want to plant native. There's even a website with what's called Plant Finder where you can, based on characteristics that you input, it will even display things that could work for the areas that you're hoping for. And the horticulture staff are really very knowledgeable. I direct a lot of questions their way because that's not my strength, but fortunately they're always happy to help out with that. And so anybody who's really wanting to make that switch from just whatever plants the local store has to really trying to go fully native for the benefit of the pollinators, the songbirds, the soil microbes, we're talking everything here. I really encourage them to get a hold of native plant trusts and get help with choosing native plants. The nursery, sells seedlings for planting, which makes the whole process a lot easier for people.
That's excellent because that just gives people such a great starting point where, they might not know what to do. So it's wonderful that
Yeah.
Plant Trust can help people on that path. What are some things you wish everyone knew about native plants and foraging?
I wish I could download what's in my mind to everybody, right? Because it takes a long while to build up sort of a knowledge base of all of these wild plants because we have to know how to identify them, what habitats they're found in, when we gather them, how we gather them. Some require processing prior to consumption, how we cook them. And when we're talking, several hundred species of edible plants out there on the landscape, it seems too daunting. And I would encourage people just take it one species at a time. Know that it's a lifelong pursuit and don't worry about how much you know. Just be sure to know the species that you're consuming well, right? So if you want to collect various things like wild grapes, there are really easy ways to never get confused. For example, when a taxonomist helps you with these things, the grape family, for example, is known because it has tendrils that occur opposite the leaves. In fact, it's the only plant family that I know of in this region that shows that characteristic. Tendrils occur opposite the leaves. So now we're in that family, and we're not in say, the moonseed family, which contains a toxic lookalike to grapes, right? They don't have tendrils opposite the leaves. So we can easily separate these things and just go one species at a time, build your knowledge base, and move on. And don't worry about knowing everything you see. Just sort of do a nice detailed study on what you're interested in and take it slow.
That's great advice. That makes it feel a lot more doable, just taking
Yeah.
one step at a time. Are there any other things that you would like to share about foraging, native plants, or the Native Plant Trust?
Yes, interact with all of those. Native Plant Trust obviously has a really wonderful education program where you can learn a lot about plant identification. Remember, that is the number one obstacle for most people, particularly in the Northeast, where they do have access to some, shall we say, unurban land, right? Some rural and wilderness landscapes where they can get out, even if they're small fragments, and do foraging. But that identification piece is something that we have to overcome so we can feel confident gathering those foods and bringing them home to our family. Because in the supermarket, that's the one thing that's been done. The identification has been done for you. And most people know all of those fruits and vegetables by look because it's what they've interacted with, right? And so I encourage you, what I tell my students is don't just take classes in foraging, also take classes in plant identification. And it will actually propel yourself even further because once you know what the plant is, it becomes much easier to look up information on it. But if you have no idea what this plant is sitting in front of you, you don't know what to look up, right? So we need to put the name on it first to make sure we know who it is.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining the podcast today, Arthur. This is a really cool topic that I think a lot of people are becoming really interested in. So I appreciate your time and the work that you're doing for native plants and foragers.
Thank you so much. And
Great
again,
job.
thank you for inviting me.